welcome to the first lecture video for Ecology this fall semester at St. Vincent College. I'm Dr. Duwenis, and this is my bee outfit that I wore for this very special occasion. And I have a scrunchie in that has bees on it as well. This was made by Danielle Chorba, who's also a St. Vincent student. You can follow her on Instagram at Scrunchiella and get cool scrunchies from her. She sent me 2 bumblebee scrunchies. Anyway, welcome to Ecology. First, let me go over the format of how these lecture videos are going to work and then how you'll be tested on them. So, before you watch this video, go to Ecology and download the PowerPoint for this lecture. At the very end of that PowerPoint, you will have learning goals. For every lecture, I will have a list of learning goals. You can think of these learning goals as a contract for what I will assess you on the exam. I don't like to play tricks or games or make it a mystery. I want to be upfront and clear with you about what I want you to be able to do on the exam. So that's what these learning goals are. What I'll also do is I'll compile all the learning goals for, exam 1 into a single document, and you can think of that as a study guide. So what I suggest you do when you study for the exam, and I suggest you do it like while you're watching the lecture, is go through while you're watching the lecture and answer the questions that are part of the learning goals. And that'll be you filling out your study guide. And then before the exam, review that study guide. Remember, make sure you can recall those answers, because even though we're going to be doing online and open note, it'll be important that you don't have to look up the answer to every single question. So you will have to study for these exams, even though they will be open notes. So go on Schoology, download the PowerPoint lecture slides, print them out, do whatever you feel like, and then follow along by using those learning goals and filling them out as you go along. So that will be the structure for all the videos. Let's get into it. Let's talk about ecology. Hopefully, these first few lectures should be a review of stuff you already know, but I want to make sure everyone's on the same page. Maybe there are things you learned a few years ago. So let's get your science brain working again to remember some of these things you've already learned in Gen Bio. Like I said, I'm Dr. Duwenis. That's Duwenis. You can also just call me Dr. D if you forget how to pronounce my name. And this is Ecology. Here are some bees. Y'all already know that I study bees. So I thought I'd start off by telling you a little bit about how I got into ecology and why I love it. And my first love for ecology and insects in particular started with these beautiful beetles here. So this is one that I'm hoping we find during lab this semester. This is Cicindela sexcutata, the 6-spotted tiger beetle. You can buy stickers I made of this beetle in my Etsy shop. And then this is Cicindela marginapennis. I did 2 different research projects in undergrad where I studied these beetles. I did one where I was looking at the degradation of DNA in museum specimens of tiger beetles. So I got really old tiger beetles that were collected 80 years ago and up to recent specimens that I had collected that year, and looked at how fast DNA degrades in museum specimens of beetles. And then I also participated in the summers in an ecological survey of Cicindela marginapennis, which is locally endangered and extinct in Ohio and Indiana. And so we were surveying to try to see if we could find any populations. And we did. It was really exciting to find. We spent most of the summer canoeing up and down rivers in Indiana and Ohio, trying to find this beetle on the cobblestone shore banks of those rivers. And we did find a few sites, and that's when I got really into ecology and conservation. And then after I did my undergrad at Mount St. Joseph University in Cincinnati, near where I grew up in Kentucky, I then went on to get my master's and my PhD in entomology, which is a study of insects, at the University of Illinois. And I did my master's and my PhD research on this extraordinarily beautiful bumblebee, Bombus ephipiatus, or Bombus ephipiatus, however you want to pronounce it. This is a bumblebee that's native to Mexico and Central America, and is currently used as a commercial pollinator for crops there, as a native alternative to a bumblebee that's native to the United States. So what you can do is you can buy a little box, cardboard box, and then put it in your greenhouse and open up a little port, and the bumblebees will fly out and they will pollinate your tomatoes or your eggplants. This is bumblebee pollinating a tomato, and so they're really important for agriculture, but also for native communities as well. They're really cool bees, and this is how I started my love affair with bumblebees. I also was involved in a study looking at this pathogen. You learned about Microsporidia actually in Gen Bio. This is Microsporidium. It's kind of like a fungus, but it's not a fungus, and it affects bumblebee guts. And what it does is it kind of gives them bee dysentery. This is a poor bee that kind of pooped itself, and it's really bad for them. So I also studied the historical transmission of this pathogen throughout the United States in bumblebees. If you were in Monday's lecture, you already heard this. And then I also, so after I graduated, I went to a postdoctoral position, which is really common if you're in the life sciences, to do a thing called a postdoc. It's a temporary position that's 2 to 3 years usually. That lets you build upon the research that you did for your dissertation. So I went and did one at the University of California, Riverside, with Hollis Woodard, who is still a friend and collaborator. And I'm still working on one project, and Graham Merlin, who's going to be in the Friday group of Ecology, is going to help out with this project, is looking at parasites and pathogens in bumblebees in Alaska and in the Arctic Circle. This is one really beautiful species up there. This is Bombus centralis. So in 2016, I went on an expedition with several researchers to Alaska and the Arctic Circle and pulled guts out of like 800 bumblebees to see what kind of parasites and pathogens are living inside of them. And Graham is going to look at all these guts for his senior research project. And I was also started a project that was funded by the United States Department of Agriculture that I am still continuing on at St. Vincent, that I named the Sierra Nevada Bumblebee Health Project. So I spent about 4 months in 2017 living in Yosemite. This is me in Yosemite Valley doing field work. And I traveled throughout a large part of the range of the Sierra Nevada, collecting bumblebees to understand more about their health. Right here, some pollen loads that this bee collected. So I collected all their pollen loads to look at the nutrition profiles of these pollens. I looked at what flowers they were visiting. And then I also dissected out their brains to look at their gene expression. So that's a project that's still ongoing too. Now, that's a little bit about me and some of the ecology research that I do. Let's talk a little bit about the basics of what ecology is. So this is Chapter 1 of your textbook. First, let's talk about what ecology is. Let's talk about the historical definition. So the first time that ecology is really defined is by Ernst Haeckel in 1866. This is an illustration by Ernst Haeckel. And so I'll just read off here what it says, what he says about ecology. By ecology, we mean the body of knowledge concerning the economy of nature, the investigation of the total relations of the animal, both to its inorganic and to its organic, including above all its friendly and inimical relations with those animals and plants with which it comes directly or indirectly into contact. In a word, ecology is the study of all of those complex interrelationships referred to by Darwin as the conditions of the struggle for existence. I recently learned that Ernst Haeckel is a very problematic figure in the history of biology. He was a eugenicist, contributed a lot of misinformation and damaging information to scientific racism, and he provided a lot of foundations for what then became the quote-unquote reasoning behind the Nazi Party. So, not a great dude. Quite a bad dude, actually. Anyway, that's Ernst Haeckel, and he was one of the first people to define the term ecology. Now, for our class, the definition that we'll be working with is the scientific study of the relationships between organisms and their environment. So let's define some of the pieces of that definition of ecology. Environment is the physical and chemical conditions and living components of an organism's surroundings. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. And then the relationships are the interactions with the physical world, members of the same species, and other species. We're really going to zoom in on all these different pieces of these definitions over the course of this semester. And if you're in the Monday group, you already did this exercise, and you'll do it on Friday. If you're in the Friday group, is think about if you were an ecologist and you were interested in studying bees, what kinds of things might you be interested in understanding about the ecology of this bee on this flower? And we'll talk about that on Friday in our outdoors lesson. Now, ecology used to be sort of a lesser known field in the biological sciences, but there are two events that kind of brought ecology to the forefront of people's minds. It's a word that gets used a lot in common vernacular now, and it's because of these two events, one of which was the atomic bomb. Because of the atomic bomb, and then also because of Chernobyl and the devastating effects that atomic bombs started to have on the environment, people started to care a lot more about the environment, and people started studying the ecology of the environments that were affected by nuclear weapons. The other thing that happened is that after the advent of nuclear weapons is that Rachel Carson, who is a native to this area, and we will read some pieces of Silent Spring this semester during our literature discussions. Rachel Carson even has a center named after her at Chatham, where she went to school. So she's very local, so we'll be reading a little bit from Silent Spring, and that was published in 1962 and kind of launched the environmental movement. And then the environmental movement then led to the foundation of the Environmental Protection Agency. And so as we read that book, you'll see that this author, Rachel Carson, brings to light how a lot of industrial practices, and highlights a lot of them actually in Western Pennsylvania, and also agricultural practices, threaten and endanger the environment around us. So these two events are what really brought ecology to the forefront of people's minds in the public, and why that word is now pretty commonly understood by most of the general public. I don't know, that might be an overgeneralization. Now let's talk a little bit about what an ecosystem is too. This is also a word that kind of gets thrown around in non-biological fields now too, but let's talk about what ecosystem means in terms of ecology. So we talked about how ecology studies the relationship of animals and other organisms with their environment. And so when we're thinking about an ecosystem, we're thinking about not only the biotic interactions that an organism is having in the environment. So what are certain species of plants interacting, what other species of plants are they interacting with and possibly competing with in the environment? What possible animals are feeding on them? Looking at things like food webs, that's the biotic component of an ecosystem. And then the abiotic component are the non-living or physical chemical, so particularly what we're going to look at in lab is look at some of the chemical properties of the streams that are around us that may have changed due to mining. So they've been artificially altered by human activity. So we're going to be looking at like iron concentrations and other heavy metal concentrations in the local streams around us. So, but some of that is natural as well. So it can also be so that's part of the chemical aspect of studying an ecosystem, but there's also the physical aspects. So physical barriers, a city, depends on how you define it. You could consider it living since there's all these people in it, but these physical structures create clear barriers, at least in urban areas, to ecological interaction. So when we're studying an ecosystem, we're thinking about the biotic and the abiotic components of that environment. Now, ecology is a hierarchical field of biology that starts at the individual level and can go all the way up to the biosphere. And there are different types of studies that encompass each of these hierarchical levels of ecology. So this is a figure from your textbook that just uses one example, one that's really nice for us because we have this species and these types of prairie communities here in Pennsylvania. And we actually have one that we're working in for lab, Winnie Palmer Nature Reserve. So at the individual level, what you're doing is you're studying how individual organisms, now obviously you're going to be looking at multiple individuals, respond to the environment or interact with the environment. So here's a nice summary here. What characteristics allow the echinacea? If you're in Monday Lab, we saw some of this out at Winnie Palmer. This is a purple coneflower. What characteristics allow it to survive, grow, reproduce in the environment, in the prairies that it grows in? I've done a lot of individual ecology projects looking at how individual bumblebees, particularly queen bumblebees, respond to environmental stressors. And a lot of the research projects that the seniors working in my lab this semester are going to be doing are going to be at the individual level, seeing how individual bees or individual plants or individual sea urchins respond to environmental stressors. So that's what we mean by the individual level of ecology. Then there's the population level. So then what you're looking at here is how an entire population of individuals responds as a whole. So you're not looking at individual responses. So like maybe an example of individual would be you'd look at genes expression, or maybe you would look at the individual growth of a single plant. In population, you're looking at how the entire population responds as a whole. So are you increasing the numbers of flowers in the area? Are there decreasing numbers of flowers in the area? And what are the factors that affect those changes in population? And then as you go the scale up, you go to the community. So this is looking at not only purple coneflower, but maybe butterfly weed. I can't really tell what this other flower is, but how are all the other wildflowers that are in this prairie community interacting with each other, and how do they influence each other's growth in the environment, growth and reproduction in the environment. Next level up from that is the ecosystem. So here's some really great examples of what you might study at the ecosystem level. So how do yearly variations in rainfall. A lot of ecosystem studies are going to be looking at climatic variables, which is the next lecture that we're going to talk about, and how climatic variables might affect a much larger area that encompasses maybe an entire prairie grassland ecosystem rather than maybe like Winnie Palmer Nature Reserve by itself. And then upscale from that is a landscape. So landscapes include multiple types of ecosystems. We're going to talk about the different types of ecosystems this semester. So how do variations in topography and soils influence the different types of ecosystems that you might find within a landscape? We'll talk about in the next lecture what topography is, but a lot of landscape studies look at topography, which is, you can see, is changes in elevation and physical barriers in the environment. And then up from that is the biome level. So a lot of biome level ones are going to be looking at climate and geology, and how those impact patterns that you see at really large geographic scale. So like maybe the entire continent of North America. And then you have the biosphere. So biosphere level is what we're going to talk about at the end of the semester. So this is talking about things like, you learned about net primary productivity in Gen Bio, actually. Well, I think all of you did. So things like that. So we'll start at the individual level in this class, and we'll work our way up towards the end of the semester to the biosphere. Now here's just some examples of different types of ecological studies you could do at these different levels. So like at the individual level, this is most of the types of ecology that I've done, is looking at physiological ecology. So how does the morphology, the physiology, which includes things like gene expression or behavior. So in the Monday group, we talked a little bit about monitoring how a study that my collaborators did at UC Riverside was monitoring individual queen bumblebee behavior after feeding them pesticides. That would be an individual level ecological study. So how do these things of a single individual organism constrain or aid an organism's ability to survive? Population ecology, you're looking at things like birth and death rates, geography, interspecific interactions, so interactions within a single species. So at the population level, you're only looking at a single species. I'm going to say that again because sometimes people get population ecology confused with community ecology. Population ecology is looking at multiple individuals of a single species. That's important to note. Community ecology, this is where you're looking at like maybe plant pollinator interactions. So how do bees interact with flowers, and how do flowers benefit from bees that pollinate them? Looking at different relative abundances of different species. A lot of what we're going to be doing in lab at Winnie Palmer Nature Reserve is looking at community ecology. We're going to specifically be collecting a lot of data looking at the abundance of certain plant species and insect species on the nature reserve. And then in ecosystem ecology, you're looking a lot at abiotic factors and biotic factors, also the flow of energy and nutrients, because these are things that are going to they're going to be necessary for all ecosystems, but what will be necessary in the level that will be necessary in different ecosystems is going to change. And we'll talk about that more later on in the semester. Landscape includes multiple ecosystems, biomes. This is the distribution of different ecosystem types or biomes and how those might be affected by climate, why certain ecosystems and landscapes occur where they occur, and how geology might affect those. And then at the biosphere, this includes oceanography, geology, atmospheric sciences. So when we talk about climate change at the end of the semester, we'll talk a lot about biosphere studies, so linkages between ecosystems and other components of the earth. So a question you might expect on the exam is, I present you with a description of an ecological study, and you'll have to tell me what hierarchical level of ecology that study is looking at, and then justify your answer. That would be an example of a type of question you might have on the exam. Now, I made this little diagram because I think it illustrates how these hierarchical levels are connected to each other. So it's not like a single chain represented here, is that the individual is contained within all of these, and what's going on at the individual level is then going to affect what happens at the population level. What happens at the population level will affect the community, and then the other way around too. So what happens at the population level will also affect how single individuals respond to certain aspects of the environment. And the individual level is the basic unit in ecology. So the most basic unit that you can study in ecology is at the individual organismal level. Now, let's switch gears a little bit and let's go through a little refresher on the scientific method. Now, I'm going to expect you to use this method a lot on the exams. There will be essay questions where you'll have to design experiments, and so it'll be important that you remember all the steps of the scientific method. So let's go through them again real quick. So you start with the observations of natural phenomenon, and sometimes those observations are done by you or they're done by other people that you read about in the literature. And then a question arises from those observations. So these are questions that seek an explanation of that phenomenon. And then you develop a hypothesis to test your question. So this is a possible answer to the question that you propose, and usually it takes the form of a statement of cause and effect. So if this is true, then this is what happens in the environment. And usually when you're setting up an experiment, you have you have a null hypothesis, and then you might have multiple or one alternative hypothesis that you're testing with your experiment. And then you make predictions about what might happen if your null hypothesis is true or if your alternative hypothesis is true. And then in your experiment, you are seeing what happens and if they fit with these predictions. And then follows the hypothesis testing. So I'm not going to read off this whole slide to you. Now, one interesting way that ecologists have used for testing certain hypotheses is called ecological modeling. Ecological modeling is an abstract, simplified representation of a real system that allows ecologists to make predictions using an explicit set of assumptions. I'm going to repeat that again, even though you can pause the video and go back. So ecological modeling is an abstract, simplified representation of real system that allows ecologists to make predictions using an explicit set of assumptions. And the predictions from a model should be testable. So here's just one example of ecological modeling. Now, I think somebody listed that their favorite animal is an orca, but I've got this example of ecological modeling from dolphins, which is sort of close. So this is an example looking at these this genus of dolphins in the southwestern Atlantic Ocean. And what they did here is that they built a model of possible environmental suitability off the coast here of where these different species of dolphins might be found. Now you might be asking yourself, what are these models using? So all ecological models need some sort of empirical data that's collected from the field to then build the model. Those are what are going to form the parameters of the model that you're then going to build. So likely what these researchers did is they took a data set of occurrences of these dolphins off the coast. Now, maybe they didn't have a lot of data, and that's why some research use ecological modeling is that they have limited resources for sampling and for identifying localities of certain species, and then they use the model to predict where you might find those species in other places in the environment. So likely, maybe they collected some dolphins here. Maybe they didn't collect them. Maybe they just tagged them. Hopefully they didn't collect them. But maybe they had some sightings here of this species, sightings here. And then they use those latitude and longitude coordinates to then pull up what's called bioclimatic data. So bioclimatic data is information on mean annual temperature, mean annual precipitation, mean annual temperature range. These are all bioclimatic variables that are collected by large, usually atmospheric science programs, and then that data is collected for each of the localities where they found these dolphins. And then they use those as the parameters to then predict where else you might find the dolphins. So probably they found a lot of dolphins for this species along the coast. And that's why you have high environmental suitability here, is that there were a lot of dolphins they found here. Along the coast, you're probably having very similar bioclimatic variables, and so this is the range that you're likely to find this species of dolphin. Now this one here, they probably didn't find any or very few of the pantropical spotted dolphin out here, and so that has a low environmental suitability score from the ecological model. They have a much smaller, more restricted range compared to this species here. This one they probably found had a lot of records down here. This area of the coast, because it's in close geographic proximity, probably has very similar bioclimatic variables, and that's what builds this model. Now what they can do is use this ecological model to then go out and look and see if the dolphins actually go out there. So all these maps are basically predictions that they can then test by going out and doing field work. Here's another example from a bunch of my friends and collaborators. John Koch, who's now in Utah, and then these are a bunch of my collaborators in Mexico at Ecosur, and then this is Jamie Strange, who's now at Ohio State. They did this really cool study of a bumblebee called Bombus huntii, looking at the stability of different environments that this bumblebee occurs in nature. So they have this ecological model, I already talked about how they're built, of potential habitat for Bombus huntii during contemporary times, and then also during the last glacial maximum. So there are these really cool, huge data sets that are models of what climatic variables might have been during the last glacial maximum. So if we assume that Bombus huntii had the same habitat parameters as during the last glacial maximum as it did during contemporary times, then you can build a model of how stable those environments have been over time. So this is where, all these areas here, this is where they were contemporarily. These were suitable habitat for Bombus huntii now. This is a model of what might have been suitable habitat for Bombus huntii during the last glacial maximum. And then this shows, depending on how much that environment has changed from the last glacial maximum period to now, shows how stable that environment's been over time. I just think this is really cool. And then here's another type of ecological model that's very different from those last two that I showed you. So this is a model using not GPS locality data and bioclimatic variables, but data collected empirically in the lab, and then using that to project and create a model of possible probability of survival for individual bumblebees. So this is a study that you looked at some of the data from in Monday, and we'll look at on Friday. So this is the effect of certain pesticides and different types of diet on bumblebee queen success. And so here, the information that's going into this model are survival rates of different queen bumblebees. So a bunch of queen bumblebees were fed either imidacloprid, or they were not fed pesticides, and then they were also fed different types of pollen diets. So that's another parameter that's going into this model, as well as whether or not they died and when they died. And then that data is then used to project, to create a likelihood of probability for bumblebee queens in general, depending on the treatment. And so what you can see here is that you've got a much higher survival probability over the course of your life if you've never eaten pesticides, but if you've been exposed long-term to pesticides over the course of your life from day 0, you've got a really low survival probability. And here, when you read it in the abstract, you can read a little bit about the types of models that Crystal used and ran to create this survival probability curve. So those are just some examples of types of ecological models. Let's talk a little bit about environmental science, because it's a lot of ecologists study the impact of humans on the environment. And so environmental science and ecology are very, very linked in modern biology. That may not have been true 40 years ago, but again, like I said, with the use of nuclear weapons and then the publication of Silent Spring, a lot of ecologists, me included, study how humans are affecting the natural world. So, definition for environmental science, which is the major that some of you have, is the study of the impacts of humans on the natural environment. And there are 4 crucial environmental problems facing humanity that environmental science tends to focus on that we will talk about in this course and in your textbook. 1 is human population growth. 2nd is biological diversity. 3rd is sustainability. And the 4th is global climate change. So human population growth, biological diversity, sustainability, and global climate change. We'll talk about a little bit about all of those, mostly in our literature discussions for the semester. So that's a little intro to ecology. Coming at you soon with a chapter 2 lecture video on climate. Okay, bye-bye.